everybody knows who Leatherface is. You may have seen the 1986 Chainsaw Massacre 2 or Texas Chainsaw 3 from 1990, Texas Chainsaw Massacre The Next Generation, or Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2003, Texas Chainsaw Massacre The Beginning, or Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3D from 2013, which is its own Texas Chainsaw Massacre cinematic universe. Or you may have seen Leatherface from 2017, or the most recent Netflix adaptation, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But today we are not talking about Leatherface as an IP or as a brand. Today we are talking about the original OG cultural icon Leatherface from the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie from the 1974 masterpiece, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So the 1974 movie was made in a time that was really inflamed. Economically, obviously, but also in like a cultural upheaval way. And specifically what we're going to talk about today is the changing cultural tides that were happening around the time that this movie came out. And this movie just added to the fire by being one of the most vile films to grace the screens in its time, especially, but even today, it's a pretty disturbing and vile movie. It's really, really gross, and it's really very scary, especially for like what they were working with. There is quite literally 30 minutes of uninterrupted screaming. And if you've ever watched this movie and you live in an apartment building, just know that your neighbors literally all hate you. Basically, the plot is a group of young people are traveling in the middle of the Texas summer. They are on the way to visit an old homestead, but also to see if their grandfather was involved in a few grave desecrations that are happening in the area. In the van are 5 teenagers: Sally, Jerry, Pam, Kirk, and Sally's paraplegic brother Franklin. As the van drives past a slaughterhouse, which happens like very early in the movie, it smells disgusting, and Franklin starts talking about their shared family history of people working in that exact slaughterhouse. They eventually come across a hitchhiker that they pick up who is has a very weird vibe. He talks about his family who also worked at that slaughterhouse, and he takes a picture of the group, and then when they refuse to buy it, he burns the picture on top of this tinfoil that he keeps all his pictures in. He shows them pictures of unalived animals, and he steals Franklin's pocket knife and slices his hand, and it freaks everybody out, and he gets kicked out of the van. He also attacks Franklin with the straight razor that he brought with him. So he's just really violent. Low on gas, the group stops at a gas station / barbecue, but the owner says that the fuel won't come until tomorrow. So they're basically out of luck, but they do pick up some barbecue from this kind of like average Texas fuel station. Unknowingly, that fuel station is obviously run by the cannibal family that Leatherface belongs to. But you have to know, like, in the time that this movie was made, this is a brand new idea. The slasher wasn't really done in this way. So this was a groundbreaking plot device. The group explores a abandoned house nearby that Franklin and Sally's grandfather actually owned, and it is now dusty and abandoned and decaying. Now Kirk and Pam go and leave everybody at this house to go to a nearby swimming hole, which is a terrible idea. On the way there, they discover this other house nearby that has a bunch of decaying cars in the front lawn. They're hoping to barter for gas, so Kirk basically knocks and no one answers, so he goes inside. He is pretty rude to kind of barge into a stranger's house like that, but whatever, that's for later. And Pam waits outside on the swing while Kirk is unalived by Leatherface, and this is the first kill count of the film. Leatherface appears behind what is like this really weird slaughterhouse room inside of their house, and he takes a hammer to Kirk's head. Pam enters the house looking for Kirk. She is in this really weird room full of bird feathers. It has like decaying animal remains, but also decaying human remains. There's human furniture. There are bones on the ground. There's Blair Witch style artifacts hanging from the ceiling. It's just really, really strange. When she attempts to flee, she is caught by Leatherface and impaled on a meat hook, and she has to watch Leatherface dismember Kirk with a chainsaw. So it gets later in the day, so Jerry, Sally, and Franklin are like, where the fuck is Kirk and Pam? And so Jerry goes by himself and looks for Kirk and Pam. When he enters the house, he finds Pam's almost dead body inside of a freezer, and she is spasming and like not quite dead yet. And he is unalived in the house, obviously. So now there's only Sally and Franklin left, and it is now dark, and they do not have the keys to the car. Leatherface ambushes them with a chainsaw and chases them for a very long time. He unalives Franklin, and Sally is now running from Leatherface in one of the most tense chasing horror movie scenes ever made. And genuinely, it gets me every single time. It is so scary for some reason. I don't know what it is, but it's like just hopeless and horrifying. Don't know why. Well, I do know why, but we're going to talk about it later. So it's this chase where Sally is running everywhere. She runs into Leatherface's house unknowingly, runs all the way up to the second story, and inside of this house, she finds a seemingly dead man and woman sitting. So she obviously is scared, and she jumps out of the second story of this house and runs away, and she makes her way to that barbecue gas station that they were at earlier in the day. At first, the station attendant is comforting Sally, but then she's obviously like, okay, something's wrong with you because you're not helping me. He subdues her and he loads her into his van, and he takes her back to that house with the couple upstairs, Leatherface's family's house. And this is where it's revealed that the hitchhiker, the barbecue gas guy, and Leatherface are all family members, and they all live in this house together. So now it is the part of the movie that is just basically nonstop torture of Sally. She is not harmed as much physically, but she is emotionally and mentally tortured. She's screaming, it's horrible, and she's like at this dinner table, and they bring out the dead man from the second story, and that's actually Grandpa, plot twist, and Grandpa is still alive. He's like 150 years old. They cut Sally's finger and give it to the grandpa to suck on to come alive again, and they basically are torturing her. It's really, really messed up. So the men are taunting her, they're bickering with her, they are bickering with each other, and they are trying to end this ordeal with a sledgehammer. And if you know from the very beginning of the film, that family is involved in the slaughterhouse industry, and they were unaliving animals with hammers, but that became obsolete with the invention of the stun gun, which like unalives the animal with a gun kind of mechanism. So that is why they are so poor, because their job has become obsolete due to technology. So the grandpa is trying to unalive Sally with this sledgehammer, but it's not working because he's so old and he's like not even basically alive. So she actually breaks free, runs into the road, has an ordeal with two different people driving on the road, and she escapes, laughing maniacally in the back of a pickup truck heading towards the sunrise. And that is the first final girl as we know it. So Leatherface is chasing her with a chainsaw to the end, and this movie basically made history for its time, and that's the basic plot of it. So the film begins with this really disturbing shot of the grave desecration going on in Texas, and this scene basically sets up all the cultural connections and metaphors that this film is trying to talk about. The corpse symbolizes the changing culture of the 1970s. The social movements at the time were seen as a desecration, a disrespect, tarnishing the reputations of the dead and their more traditional lives, especially the patriarchs of the family, which is important that these teenagers are going to see their dead grandfather's grave and his house. That's very important. The 1970s was a very tumultuous time for the nuclear family. There is a reason that when you think of the 1950s, you think of the nuclear family, specifically white, and then when you think of America now, you don't think of that anymore. And that is because of what happened in the 1970s. So these tensions were especially inflamed in the South. You had like the pro-family rally in Houston that was trying to get back to those nuclear family ideas. And you had massive protests to counter events like the National Women's Conference that was basically just saying women should be able to not just be mothers. One of the best and one of the worst things about America is selfishness and individualism. When you think of America, for its faults and for its good parts, there is a deep inherent individualism in everything. And this can be very positive socially because that is meaning that everybody can decide their own future and what that looks like for them. This idea of individualism and like selfishness unshackled women from the home, gave immigrants the opportunity to be whatever they wanted to be, and so many other things for especially people of color. But America wasn't always centered on the South in this specific way. So the term me decade describes the general new attitude of Americans during the 1970s, and it was a direction of people going towards individualism rather than communitarianism. And that is basically a philosophy that centers the community over the individual, and it emphasizes the importance of that community. So this me decade was in contrast with the social values that were previously held during the 1950s and 60s. So before this wave of individual rights and freedoms, LGBTQ people and women were not expected to have their own futures, like that wasn't a right for them. The 70s was the decade where the United States ended most legal segregation by gender. The first gay rights marches took place in 1970. So many gigantic cultural movements for self-freedoms and expressions and choices happened during this time. American women, literally more than half of the population, formally gained the right to have employment and education instead of being a mother and a caretaker. So that wasn't in law until the 1970s. Also, on like the men's side, the all-volunteer military draft replaced the draft in the 1970s, so you weren't forced to serve. And also, taxes were now discussed as a burden that must be avoided rather than like a common, extremely important shared duty. And in the climate of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, without this like idea of social freedoms, this movie would never have been made, because that is what this movie is about. It is a very widely agreed upon idea that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a direct metaphor for the dissolution of the nuclear family in America. And I agree. That's not my idea though, it's many other people's ideas. Sally is a very simple metaphor for escaping the nuclear family and responsibility as a woman to be a caretaker. It is like a perversion of what her role would be. Sally, literally maybe the first final girl ever, is a direct metaphor for escaping the responsibilities of being a housewife in the nuclear family. She's escaping being trapped in a mother/caretaker role, and instead, she's able to be rebirthed in blood to be whatever she wants to be. The cannibalistic family in this film is a trap. The people born into it have no choice but to be born into it, and they cannot leave. They are essentially trapped in this nuclear family, and this specifically echoed a lot of what men and women felt during this time. Many young people in the 1970s viewed this family dynamic as oppressive and like a cage, because you're forced into one of two roles. Like, you have to either be the breadwinner who supports the family, or you have to be the caretaker who bears children, and there's not really that much option or choice. So the cannibal family of Leatherface has effectively been abandoned by society. They literally have 8 to 10 cars in their backyard with a tarp over top, and no cop has come by and said, "Why do you have so many cars in your backyard? Are you killing people?" Like, that is abandoned in one way, but they're abandoned in a lot of other ways. Now, when you're actually introduced to their family dynamics, one of the first and most jarring scenes you see of people inside the house is the deceased grandmother and the grandfather upstairs. This not only represents generational trauma and patterns, but the grandparents are literally looming over the family even though they're basically dead. This is just directly talking about how people felt during this time, like the traditions of their grandfathers and grandmothers were a consequence that they had to deal with looming over them. And also importantly, the mother/female presence is gone inside of this house. And this sets up a very layered metaphor for something really, really crazy. Now, what the nuclear family signaled in America, specifically the idea that it was a cultural non-negotiable, like you had to do it, it indirectly says that there will be dysfunction if it's destroyed and if it isn't followed. The cultural sentiment at the time was, if you don't have a nuclear family and you don't have this perfect harmony of divine men and women roles, society would collapse and children would not grow up right, and it would just be a total disaster. So the Texas Chainsaw Massacre presents a distorted reality where this is true, and you're viewing a universe where it is dysfunctional because the woman is not there to help. And I think this is so similar to John Waters and the way that he approaches talking about gay rights in his movies. He presents a distorted reality on what it would actually be like if all those cultural pressures were completely true. In John Waters' movies, gay people behave in the way that they are villainized to behave, and it ends up being comedic and insanely disgusting, and it's like not the way that the real world works. I think Texas Chainsaw Massacre does that, but with feminism and the nuclear family. It's basically showcasing what a distorted world it would be if women and men needed these roles to be functional as human beings. In the cannibal family, the grandfather cannot provide because his job was made obsolete by the stun gun, and the grandmother is dead, so there is no maternal influence. So what has happened is, without those two things, the house is in complete decay and horror. The family has turned to creating Ed Gein style human furniture, and Leatherface wears a woman's face on his face. It's almost like he's going through this desperate plea to have like a comforting influence. And Leatherface's two other family members, the brothers, are extremely dysfunctional, with one of them being a literal psychopath and the other one almost like wanting to interact with the human world, but he can't because he's so traumatized and fucked up from being in this family. And the grandfather, who is like 150 years old, when he sucks on Sally's finger, it is almost like sucking on like a mother's milk kind of thing, where without it, he is basically nothing. It's his life force. He needs this woman to live and exist. If you don't have women around to be caretakers and to be subservient to you, is this what you would be like? It's almost like a distorted version of what the culture is trying to say that men need. But what is so brilliant about this film is it doesn't just comment on gender roles, but also how Americans are abandoned. Many people have called this film like a showcase on the dead end of American experience, because when you give people trauma from slaughterhouse work, which scientifically is traumatizing, and give them no support systems in the middle of this harsh climate that is extremely isolating, and where no one is noticing that people are going missing and literally being eaten and barbecued, you're essentially creating the perfect storm for somebody to go absolutely crazy, antisocial, and traumatized beyond belief. And Leatherface doesn't mean to be scary. Like, I think other films kind of examine this a little bit more about how he's mentally ill, but him being like traumatized and afraid is very clear in the first Texas Chainsaw, and you can literally see how he's been abandoned by the decay in his teeth. Like, no one's taking care of him. His older brother, though, the gas station clerk, is literally a masochist, because he's genuinely taking pleasure in the pain he inflicts, and him being the older brother, putting his influence onto his other siblings is just another example of generational trauma in the house. And how having no outside influence is a very bad thing. The older brother is also so much more suited to civilization, which makes him a much more dangerous villain than Leatherface, if you really think about it. So the family itself is an amazing metaphor for how gender roles are passed on, and also cruelty and trauma is passed on, but also how the cycle of abuse can work when you have nobody outside of this cycle to help you escape it. The world has moved on without this family. They are effectively abandoned in every single way. Of course, they're going to grab people that come by. What else are they going to do? And it's not just them that is abandoned, it is their property, it's their house. Leatherface's family's house is in the end stage of decay. There are dead things hanging everywhere. You can compare this to Sally's grandfather's abandoned house with the daddy longlegs nesting in the corner. It's like, that's the end stage of where this would lead, because nobody's in that house anymore. Nobody really remembers what happened in that house. And it is the end of a family lineage, which is like the worst fear for a society that is pressuring people to have kids in this traditional way. And the final gruesome scenes of Sally screaming and being tortured evokes a feeling of warning and dread with these close-up scenes and the really intense and grating screaming that makes you want to escape. And finally, as a little cherry metaphor on the very top, Leatherface chasing Sally around with a chainsaw is like a symbol of trying to rope women into traditional roles, because the chainsaw is phallic. Carol J. Clover invented this idea, but I agree, a lot of weapons are very phallic, and it's a substitute for that. When you have a chainsaw or something that is long and aggressive and trying to get something. So her escape signified a really crazy cultural movement at the time. It signaled a changing tide in which women were able to choose their own lives, which sounds crazy because we're so many years later and that's a given, but it wasn't a given when this film was made. And this film was so important that it set up how a lot of horror movies are made now. If you haven't noticed, most horror is very socially conscious because it is the most extreme. And it's quite interesting to think about where horror would be without this movie, because so many horror movies are just spin-offs of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So that is my little analysis for Summerween. I love Summerween. This is the time where it's halfway to Halloween. I'm gonna watch all my desert horror movies. Thank you for watching. If you watched till the end, love you so much. But I hope you have a great day or a great night, and peace and love.